Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure most of you have heard by now, Terrence Crawford claims Bob Arum's revolting racial bias has hurt his career. He is now suing Bob Arum and Toprank in a court of law, hoping to amount $10 million.
$10 million in damages.
This is a really bad move, I have to say that. And in light of this, I feel that this is one of those subjects that's going to spark a lot of debates in the coming days and weeks.
But I'm not about to die on a hill over it.
Portion of the article reads, "This could be the most bruising legal boxing bout of all time. Welterweight champion Terrence Crawford is challenging famed boxing promoter Bob Arum in a bombshell lawsuit, claiming the promoter's revolting racial bias prevented him from landing big fights and earning tens of millions of dollars, according to court papers filed in Nevada. Crawford, who signed a deal with 90-year-old New York-born Arum and his company, Toprank, in 2011, alleges in his complaint that Arum simply does not care about support or know how to promote black fighters, and didn't build him into a marquee fighter."
For the sake of Terrence Crawford's lawsuit, I hope he has more of a case than that.
Because it sounds a lot like he doesn't have a case, short of damning audio and video.
If you're saying his racial bias hurt your career, you're the one that's got to substantiate it.
Crawford, 34 years old, famously split with Arum at a November 2021 press conference, saying he wanted to become a free agent to better land his dream bout with Errol Spence Jr. The fighter has hired top attorney Brian Friedman and is suing for almost $10 million. But the blows, he rains on Arum in the lawsuit.
The lawsuit filed in the 8th Judicial District Court in Nevada.
So let me see if I understand this. You're suing Bob Arum and Toprank because you say they didn't promote you well enough.
Well enough to get that Errol Spence Jr. fight.
And you're saying they didn't promote you well enough because you're black.
That seems to be the lawsuit. That seems to be his case.
The lawsuit filed in the 8th Judicial District Court in Nevada on Wednesday states Crawford shines a spotlight on the systemic racism that runs through Toprank. Toprank's complete inability to properly promote black fighters, and Toprank, Arum, and his son-in-law Todd Duboff's disparate treatment of black fighters, including Crawford.
Okay, if it's systemic racism, you've got to prove it exists.
Within Toprank, it's up to Terrence Crawford and his legal counsel to substantiate these accusations. Crawford alleges in further fighting talk in the filing, Arum clearly shows his revolting racial bias to impact the fighters he is obliged to promote.
Well, if he's got this existing racial bias, then why did he renew your contract in the first place?
You know, after Crawford became undisputed at 140 pounds and moved up to 147 pounds, if Arum is as biased as you say he is, why would he have offered you a renewed contract for more money?
He's biased, remember? Racially biased. According to you, he shouldn't have offered you anything, let alone more money.
The suit also mentions other big names in the sport, such as Floyd Mayweather Jr., as having been mistreated by Arum, who scoffed at the legal allegations when reached by the Post. "I haven't seen the lawsuit yet, but it's ridiculous," he said. "It is alleged in the papers exclusively obtained by the Post that for years, professional boxers and others in the sporting world have called out Toprank's owner, Bob Arum, for his disparate treatment of black boxers."
Well, if they've been calling him out for years, why'd you re-sign with him all those years ago?
When your contract was up all those years ago, why didn't you go with Al Heyman if Bob's reputation is so bad? Because this is boxing, a sport with a checkered history, and because Arum is now dismissed as just a grumpy old white man, Arum continues to make racist and bigoted statements and purposefully damage the reputations of black boxers without any consequences.
And what did he say about Terrence Crawford that damaged his reputation?
That he doesn't sell and that his pay-per-views underperform? Well, I hate to break the news to you, but that's not slander and that's not libel.
That's fact.
Slander and libel would be saying that my pay-per-view underperformed because it was put on an app.
That's more slanderous than anything Bob said about Crawford.
Because what Bob said about Crawford is a measurable, quantifiable matter of fact, since it was Bob Arum who was orchestrating fights for Terrence Crawford at the expense of his own company, in spite of Terrence Crawford losing him money every time he sent them out there. The article continues, this is generally because the affected boxers who are in long-term contracts with Top Rank fear that if they speak up, they will be placed on the sideline and not given the opportunity to fight during the life of their deal, which could be 5 to 7 years. Crawford is ranked as the world's second best active boxer, pound for pound.
Well, that's nice. There was a guy named Andre Ward who was once ranked as the world's #1 pound-for-pound boxer.
And that ranking had no bearing over his marquee value, his market value, and his ability to draw, his ability to generate revenue on pay-per-view in spite of his pound-for-pound status, however tenuous and short-lived it might have been. Andre Ward wasn't a draw, and he was once ranked as #1.
Guess what? Top Rank didn't promote that guy.
So you can't blame them for his situation. 4-division champion Chocolatito was also ranked as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport for a time, but he was never a big draw. He was never a big marquee attraction. So where do you get that because Terrence Crawford's ranked as the #2 pound-for-pound fighter in the sport?
Where do you get that that's supposed to make him a big draw by default? It didn't make those guys big draws by default.
And neither of them were promoted by Top Rank, I might add.
So you can't blame Top Rank for that.
This entire fiasco is going to spark a lot of debates and a lot of hard feelings in the coming days and weeks. And I'm not about to die on a hill for it. I can only tell you what I think. And if you want to know what I think, and you're here, so I'll assume that you do, I hope for the sake of Terrence Crawford's lawsuit, he's got more than just this. Because if it's all just this, that man doesn't have a case.
You heard what I said.
If this is it, if this is the meat and potatoes of it all, the bulk of it.
Is this it?
If he expects to go up there and say, well, my fight didn't sell because it was put on an app.
Okay, he doesn't have a case.
He expects to go up there and say, well, he couldn't get me fights with PBC fighters.
Okay, he doesn't have a case.
He expects to go up there and say, well, he damaged my reputation by saying my fights don't sell.
Okay, he doesn't have a case.
His lawsuit alleges it is painful to clear that Top Rank and especially Arum judges people based on their race. Arum's sordid history with athletes of color, especially black fighters, and his bias favoring white and Latino fighters is well documented and known throughout the boxing world. It continues by claiming Arum makes no secret of his deep-seated bias against black fighters. For example, he called legendary black boxer Floyd Mayweather Jr. soft and claimed that he shoots up cars.
Wait, so calling somebody soft is a racial epithet?
I was saying that he shoots up cars a bigoted statement. Let me tell you something. Mayweather Sr. used Floyd Mayweather Jr. as a shield when he was at gunpoint.
That's the kind of household Floyd comes from.
Floyd Mayweather Jr. got in deep with the Sharks. James Prince Jr. He owed that guy a bit of money, and in a nutshell,
It was Bob Arum that bailed him out.
only so that Terrence Crawford and his legal counsel years later could try to vilify that same Bob Arum for saying that Floyd is soft?
No, it's for saying that he shoots up cars.
Exactly. That's wildly inaccurate. Floyd's a terrible shot. What he does do is smack up girls. Though I don't know that either shooting up cars or smacking up girls could be interpreted as bigoted statements. They don't exactly highlight ethnicity or race or anything of the sort in it of themselves. Better still, the article reads, he constantly mocks rival boxing promoter Al Heyman, who is a black man. Yeah, and he constantly mocks Eddie Hearn, who is a white man. What's your point? That Al Heyman's supposed to be off limits because he's a black man?
It's okay to mock Eddie Hearn, but leave Al Heyman alone.
We all know he mocks them both, and if he mocks both Eddie and Al, in spite of Eddie and Al being different guys from different places that are different races, if he does this to the both of them, I'd call that equality, and it sounds like what you want isn't equality. What you want is preferential treatment.
It must be if you're expecting Al Heyman to be off limits based on the color of his skin.
Crawford also alleges, according to the suit, that Arum deliberately and negligently failed to build him into a pay-per-view star, and instead publicly criticized him for not attracting enough views. Arum has repeatedly claimed Top Rank had lost money on Crawford's fights. In the papers, it is alleged that Arum launched a smear campaign against Crawford to paint him as an exciting, unprofitable fighter who could not draw viewers. In truth, Top Rank, a company with 0 black executives and only 2 or 3 black employees, refuses to admit that it simply does not care about, support, or know how to promote black fighters. Recently, while most businesses have become sensitive to issues of race and social justice, Top Rank Rank has not.
But this isn't a race or social justice issue.
You not being able to draw big numbers on pay-per-view is not a civil rights issue. The article continues, at a time when most businesses took steps to honor black lives in the wake of George Floyd's murder, Top Rank actually refused to place the Black Lives Matter logo on the mats of its boxing rings. Instead of standing behind a black fighter, such as Crawford, it publicly criticized him. Top Rank's current smear campaign is deliberately aimed at punishing Crawford for possibly leaving Top Rank by making it harder for him to sign with a new boxing promoter.
So because Top Rank didn't align themselves with the BLM and pledge fealty to them, you say that makes them racist.
Is that what costed you $10 million? Them not putting BLM mats on the boxing rings of their fights?
Telling you, he doesn't have a case.
Crawford continues by claiming in the suit, tellingly, Arum has not subjected any of his white fighters to this kind of vicious, vengeful treatment. Clearly, Arum feels he is entitled to profit indefinitely off Crawford and other black fighters, and he will retaliate whenever they dare to assert their independence. It adds, in this action, Crawford seeks the right to wrongdoings inflicted on him by Top Rank. Top Rank has repeatedly breached its contracts with Crawford and, in fact, defrauded him into entering agreements in the first place. The lawsuit continues. Since Top Rank will not police themselves, do the right thing moving forward as a responsible business in 2022, Crawford, who backs down to no one, will make them do so. Arum has made millions off the backs of boxers of color, including black boxers. His racist attitudes pervade every aspect of his dealings with black boxers like Crawford. You say
the guy who finances your fight slandered you by saying that you don't sell.
that this was all a smear campaign. Well, while he was campaigning to smear you, was he lying?
Did your pay-per-views actually do good numbers and he lied about it?
I hope that Terrence Crawford can substantiate any contractual breaches in his contract, because he'd likely have more luck with that than proving that Bob Arum was running a smear campaign against him. In 2018, Crawford was paid $3.5 million for a fight with Jose Benavidez Jr. and $4.8 million to take on Amir Khan, the paper state. In 2019, Crawford had just one fight for which he was paid $4 million. Then in 2020, Crawford was paid $3.5 million to fight Kell Brock. In 2021, he earned $6 million for a Sean Porter bout, papers claim, adding that Top Rank owes Crawford no less than $4.5 million for failing to provide him with a second fight in 2019. Crawford also alleges other boxers of color, including Mayweather Jr., have also suffered from Arum's alleged racism.
Arum's alleged racism. Those millions of dollars that you were paid all came from Arum and his company.
Crawford is demanding a jury trial where damages expected to be up to $10 million will be decided. Meanwhile, despite Crawford's claims, the boxing world remains in doubt that a Crawford versus Spence bout billed as the ultimate welterweight showdown of this generation could even take place, because Crawford hasn't been built into a big pay-per-view star. Premier Boxing Champion's VP of Communications, Tim Smith, recently said, "You don't want to insult Crawford, but he hasn't been built into a pay-per-view star. The numbers won't be enough to give him what he wants," and I think the same will ring true here, because building a pay-per-view star is not an exact science. If it were, everybody would have one. Matchroom, Golden Boy, main events, Duco events.
Building a pay-per-view star is not an exact science, because if it were, everybody would have one.
More than one. If it were an exact science that could be duplicated in a controlled environment, they'd have more than one. They'd have 2, 3, and 4. They'd have as many as they could replicate, as many as they could produce, if it were an exact science. But therein lies the dilemma.
What?
Building a pay-per-view star is not an exact science, and the hard truth, the hard pill that nobody wants to swallow is, not everybody belongs on pay-per-view. Not every fight, not every fighter, even though every fighter aspires to become a big pay-per-view attraction, a big pay-per-view draw, so they can make as much money as they possibly can.
Pay-per-view in and of itself ain't for everybody.
They put Charles Martin and Luis Ortiz on pay-per-view very recently. What did that do? What do you think Thurman versus Barrios is going to do when that's on? What do you think Davis versus Cruz really did?
I think a lot of boxers and I think a lot of people in boxing need a lesson in commerce.
Bob Arum and this alleged bias, this racial bias that Terrence Crawford alleges he has, makes absolutely no sense. And it makes no sense because Top Rank sabotaging Terrence Crawford, it doesn't benefit Top Rank.
Why would they want to set you up to fail when they're the ones that are invested in you?
It's their money. You go out there, you do a Terrence Crawford fight. You think you're doing it on Terrence Crawford's dime. You think you're doing it with his money. No, you're doing it with Top Rank's money. And Top Rank wanted Terrence Crawford to succeed just as much as Terrence Crawford wanted to succeed. But Top Rank didn't have the run of the place at 147 pounds, and a lot of people don't want to understand that. that. They can't force Errol Spence Jr. to fight him. They can't force any of those PBC welterweights to fight him. And not being able to fight those fighters is what hurt Terrence Crawford's marquee value, not Bob Arum.
Bob Arum was fulfilling his fiduciary duty to you by orchestrating your fights and ensuring that he pays you your contract minimum.
Even if paying you that contract minimum left him in the red, which it did. Now, I reiterate, there's going to be a lot of arguments, a lot of discussions, a lot of debates about who's in the right and who's in the wrong here. And I myself, am not about to die on a hill over this thing. But from the looks of it, unless Terrence Crawford has some kind of audio or video to substantiate and thereby characterize the alleged racial bias.
Well, he has to characterize it and then prove that it costed him millions.
Substantiate to thereby constitute how that racial bias was in play in reference to his relationship with Toprank and how he was treated whilst under contract with them and how that affected his earning potential.
I'm telling you, the guy doesn't have a case.
Because as much as I might like Terrence Crawford as a fighter, he's no Perry Mason, he's no Matlock.
A lot of the guys you're going to see arguing about this can't read above the 9th grade level.
Thus, many of the talking points illustrated in this video will go right over their heads like a magpie in Australia.
They won't get it.
They just don't. Terrence Crawford not being a big draw on pay-per-view. Top Rank's failure to turn him into a big marquee attraction with a lot of market value.
And they did fail to do that, but what people are missing is that it's not entirely their fault.
Whilst under contract with them, you were campaigning in a division where the rival promoters' fighters have the run of the place. There's not a lot that Top Rank could have done about that.
Regardless of how you feel about Bob Arum, there's not a lot they could have did.
Top Rank could not have forced Errol Spence Jr. to enter into an agreement with them. They couldn't force him to work with you guys to do this fight. For you, they did the best they could under those circumstances. They got your fights, they paid you your contract minimum.
But if those fights didn't do big numbers, that's not a civil rights issue.
That does not characterize a racial bias any more than calling Floyd Mayweather Jr. soft characterizes a racial bias. And it will take more than this to substantiate this case.
I think Terrence Crawford just burned one of the few bridges he had left to cross.
That's what I think, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that in the videos to come moving forward, though, as far as this, Terrence Crawford's case against Bob Arum, against Top Rank, well, he doesn't appear to have one.
This ain't Twitter, this ain't YouTube.
Let me tell you something, sweetheart. This ain't social media where you get to run around saying anything about anyone and don't have to prove it. In a court of law, you've got to prove it. The burden of proof is on the accuser, and you're accusing him of having a racial bias. So it's up to you and your legal counsel to constitute it. Not only constitute it, but prove that
You have to prove that that racial bias affected how Top Rank was promoting you and your fights.
And not figuratively, literally. You've got to prove that they didn't hold up their end of the bargain on paper.
And for those that know, that's easier said than done.